I have the easiest job here today, which is just to welcome you and then hand it over to our experts who are going to be hosting the webinar. I'm Marian. I am co-founder of Remove. We're a nonprofit running an accelerator program in Europe and also convening the ecosystem. And we're very happy to be collaborating with our friends at Carbon Gap for the quarterly CDR policy updates for Europe here. We have an excellent speaker who actually is an alumni of the CDR accelerator which we run, which I am even more excited about to see Kenneth here today. But Clotilde from Carbon Gap is going to host and also introduce our speakers. So very happy to hand over to her and to see all of you in attendance.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this. It's now, I believe, the third, or at least we've hosted a few quarterly policy updates with Remove, but this is the very first of this year. And we're starting on what I believe to be quite a very exciting topic, something that we don't always take the time to explore, because we're turning our eyes to, I believe most of you, for you, it will be the North. We're going to look at the region of the Nordics. According to most common agreements, the Nordics is composed of 5 countries: Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And generally, they do tend to invest quite a lot in carbon removal policies and development. And so we're interested in knowing how they do it so successfully and what can we learn from them. And as Marian very rightfully presented, our speaker today would be Kenneth Möllersten. I'll give him the opportunity to introduce himself. He will have about half an hour to talk about his topic, and then we will turn to you all attending right now. Feel free to send any question you might have in the Q&A section, and we will make sure to answer as many as we can. Please, as usual, be respectful and make sure that you wait until your question has been answered to ask a new one so that we don't flood the chat. Thank you very much. And Marian, Kenneth, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks a lot. So now I'll see then if I can turn on my camera. Yes, it worked, but yeah, good. And I notice now I have a background that I wasn't expecting to see. It's a startup I'm working with that has been part of the accelerator. Right. So my name is Kenneth Möllersten. I'm a researcher at IVL, Swedish Environmental Research Institute, and I'm also part-time. This is a part-time position. I'm also part-time researcher at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Department of Chemical Engineering, Division of Process Technology, and then as a third occupation, I'm one of the co-founders of a startup called Reverse Carbon, which develops activities in the biochar space. But today I'm here to talk about the Nordics, and as you introduced, Clotilde, and I'd just like to start out just to thank you for the opportunity to speak. It's always interesting to share your views with others and get some feedback and maybe expand your knowledge a little bit. So start from there. So I'll share my screen, and then hopefully soon you will have my slides. Put it in presentation mode as well. So now I'm hoping that everything is looking fine. Yes, good. Yeah, the Nordics. What I will try to cover here today, these like 30 minutes, is really focused on 2 main areas. The Nordic countries work, or like how Nordic countries have structured carbon neutrality targets and the role of carbon removal in these targets, because this is really the foundation for any activities that are ongoing to create incentives and actual deployment of CDR in the countries, and then some reflections related to what is there to learn already from these targets and the way they have been implemented so far. And then I'll talk about incentive systems, what is done today in the Nordic countries to actually get the full CDR value chain up and running. So that will be more or less a very short sweep across all 5 countries in alphabetical order, as compared to Clotilde's. It's very sensitive about who you mention first. Alphabetical order means Sweden comes last, so that's good for me, since I'm from Sweden. And then yes, some words on regulation and Nordic coordination, really, based on what has been done so far, and some lessons that we have learned about, where there might be some barriers and so on. And I think that will be the stepping stone to start the discussion. So speaking of CDR and the Nordic countries, really is very much about, most Nordic countries have a lot of forest. And the LULUCF sector is very important in terms of the overall greenhouse gas balances. So, we have a lot of carbon uptake in the LULUCF sector. This is important, but it's been like that for ages. Then a lot of countries now in the north are looking towards BECCS, and this we'll get into why this is happening. It's really quite easy to understand, and a lot of what I will be talking about today will be about BECCS. There are certainly other things going on in the Nordic countries. We have, at least in Finland, Sweden, and Norway, we have companies who are developing great ideas for example, in biochar. But to my knowledge, there is not so much policy in that space yet. We have some DACs, as you all know, world famous DACs in Iceland, but perhaps not so much policy really for this. And then we have the other. This image is lacking some CDR methods, but it's some fundamental methods are there. Ocean-based CDR, enhanced weathering. Honestly, I don't have a complete understanding of what is happening in those spaces in the Nordic countries, but there certainly isn't that much, and there certainly isn't that much policy in that affects those CDR methods. So there will be quite a lot of BECCS in my talk today, and I think now you understand why. So on mitigation targets in the Nordic region, we have, since a few years back, a Nordic declaration of carbon neutrality. The Nordic countries expressed that they want to lead by examples and become the first carbon neutral region in the world. And there are good intentions, but there is no target year. It's not really that specific, what emissions are covered and how. But interestingly, this declaration that was signed by ministers from all countries really does underline the significance of carbon capture and storage and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. It's in there in the declaration very clearly. But then, after that declaration was signed, all countries in the Nordics have set their own net zero or near net zero targets, framed in different ways, not always using the term net zero, sometimes carbon neutrality or climate neutrality. There are a lot of variations that are quite interesting, but they all have in common that in the end there will be residual emissions that need to be counterbalanced, and this is obviously where CDR comes in. I don't need to educate you about that, obviously. So looking at how the Nordic countries have worked on their net zero targets. This is just the fundamental. We have the 3 pillars of the EU climate targets in different shades of blue. And then for each country, we have some figures. It's the emissions in the trading sector and ESR together for 1990 levels and 2020 levels. And then the uptake or emissions, actually net emissions in the land use sector in the dark blue, also for 1990 and 2020. And what's striking here perhaps is that if you look at Sweden, Norway, and Finland, no, sorry, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, the numbers are very similar, 71, 71, 71, and 46, 43, 47. So there has been a very similar development when it comes to the emissions in those sectors. But as you can see, Denmark and Iceland, the LULUCF sector is actually a net source of emissions and not a net sink. Then coming now to net zero targets. So we have net zero targets more or less in all Nordic countries. Framed and developed independent of each other. They're set for different years. The earliest is 2035, very offensive of Finland, very attacking net zero. And then the last one's 2050. So you can see this variation here. What is really interesting also is, what do these targets actually cover? That's illustrated by how broad these green ovals are. So if we look at Sweden, for example, the net zero target is set for the trading sector and the ESR. So this is where there is supposed to be net zero. If you look at the numbers for Sweden already in 2020, if you include the total LULUCF sector, we're not that far away from net zero already, 6 million tons. But if you look at Finland, for example, they've included all sectors in their net zero targets. I mean, I've been part of projects where you see these numbers and then someone proposes to say that, okay, so Finland is the most ambitious. And then, I mean, you really need to look at the full picture. So what is covered by these net zero targets to make a comparison? And really, they're actually quite difficult to compare. You have to consider they have a lot of different dimensions. The Norwegian target is not even a net zero target. It's a low emission society with 90 to 95% reductions compared to 1990. But that's, of course, fair enough. So there are also milestone targets. Let's not waste time on those, just so you see that they are there. They look different. But in the end, these are now figures taken from official communications from the respective countries, but it's rather data that have been calculated by a PhD student who I'm supervising. But they're really showing the residual emission levels in each country that appear to have been considered or have been sort of generated when the countries assumed their net zero targets. So in the Swedish case, it's very specific. So it's 10.7. That's 85. Well, it's 15% of the emissions in 1990. Interestingly, if you look at Finland, the residual emission level is actually 21 million tons, since they have included the entire LULUCF in their target for net zero. And since they have such a significant, or had such a significant sink when they set their target, they could sort of allow themselves to remain with quite a few emissions essentially in the ETS or trading sector and ESR because it was neutralized by the uptake in LULUCF. What is really interesting here, staying a while focusing at Finland, is that these numbers have changed drastically in the last few years. And the last the last year for which there is complete data, the LULUCF sector in Finland went from a significant carbon sink to actually a net source of emissions. So that's a huge leap from these minus 17 in 2020 to becoming a net source. And this obviously makes it very difficult for Finland to attain net zero by 2035. I think there is a lot to learn from this. And why did this happen? What I understand is that there is more logging, there is slower growth, and there's also some changes to the way that some wetlands are, basically the inventory guidelines for some wetland emissions have changed. So this also added some to the net balance. What to say about these national targets? First of all, it's really like apples and oranges if you try to compare them. They cover different scopes. They have different timelines. It's very easy to focus on those timelines, particularly years, but it's a mistake doing so. And they also differ very much about their approach to compensating the residual. I didn't say so much about that, but for example, for the Swedish target, one way of compensating the residual is the use of international credits from Article 6. So Sweden can use ITMOs. So that's going towards international solutions, whereas other Nordic countries have not considered that and are really looking at true, what you call, domestic net zero. Also, why do we have these targets? It might seem a bit confusing to some, considering that there is so much work going on right now in the EU. We have the Fit for 55, and we're looking at very ambitious targets now hopefully for 2035 and 2040. But bear in mind that all these Nordic national targets, they were prepared in a time when EU policy was much more relaxed than it is today. And we couldn't really, we didn't know where the EU was going. Now, obviously, with these national targets and sort of the EU catching up in climate policy, then there is a discussion: do we even need these national targets? And it's a justified discussion. It gets a bit strange. When you have overlapping targets, it can make things a little bit difficult. But when they were prepared initially, there was certainly a reason to do so. So you could look at the Nordic countries and the entire region as a kind of testing ground for net zero targets that we can learn lessons from. It's really important to consider what actually constitutes the net zero target. How there are so many different combinations across reducing emissions, land-based sequestration, and then finally novel CDR, engineered CDR, whatever you want to call it. So that's obviously very important. How to determine the residual? As you saw, in some cases, the resulting residual on the national level is somewhere in the range 5 to 10%. In some cases, if you consider the entire LULUCF sink, then it's basically half of what the emissions were in 2020. So those results are really quite different. And then all this gives rise to one very important question: that there will be a need for neutralization in the end. Who's going to pay for it, and how? How do we incentivize all the CDR that will be necessary? So that is, in a way, the next part of so that's the sort of introduction to the second half of the presentation. But before we start looking at incentives, then a few words about the situation to actually accomplish CDR in the Nordic region. So these are unpublished numbers that the PhD student Malin Tash at KTH has calculated, and also she made this image. Unfortunately, Denmark is data for Denmark have not been added to the chart because simply Denmark was quite a lot more tricky than the other countries due to the way the statistics that were available. So it's just a map. We have the numbers, but they're not in the map yet. But looking at how to do CDR in the Nordic countries, well, we have all these green dots here are biogenic point CO2 emissions over 100,000 tons per year. Some of them are larger than 1 million tons per year from one source. So that would typically be a pulp mill. And many of the smaller ones are typically combined heat and power plants that are biomass fired. So if we add all these up, this is then above 100,000 tons per year per source, or from 100,000 tons and up. So 33 million tons in Sweden, 22 million tons in Finland, 10 million tons in Denmark, 2 in Norway, and then a very, very small level on Iceland. So there is significant potential for BECCS in Sweden. That's what I want to say. Or sorry, in the Nordics. And point sources mainly in Sweden and Finland, and storage, on the other hand, available today in Norway and coming up in Denmark and also coming up in Iceland, albeit with a kind of different approach to it. I will mention that, a bit more about that in a few slides. So obviously we're looking at BECCS, and obviously we are forced to look at cross-boundary solutions. So, I mean, this cannot be done without collaboration between countries. Okay, so the Nordic CDR policy sweep. Denmark was not really considering CCS so much for their climate policy. And then a few years ago, it suddenly changed. They're preparing to, making preparations to prepare readiness for CO2 storage, geological CO2 storage. And they want to become even a Northern European hub for CO2 logistics and geological storage. And they've introduced a subsidy scheme. So 38 billion Danish kroner divided by 7 or something like that to get the euros. To provide support for CCS that leads to either emission reductions or removals. The target is to achieve 3 million tons per year in 2030. So these funds have been allocated to 3 separate funds, and they have different eligibilities when it comes to technologies, but they all apply to CCS in one way or the other, fossil, biogenic, or even DAX. The first tranche bids were evaluated in 2023, and that was a call that was open for fossil CCS and bio CCS, but in a way, surprisingly, the winning bid was bio CCS, and that's the quite famous project that Microsoft has purchased negative emissions from, or carbon dioxide removal from Ørsted. So the total volume of that project is 430,000 tons per year to be started in 2026. So to my mind, this might be what might be worthy of being called the first real BECCS project in the world. There is some BECCS, but usually associated with enhanced oil recovery, and that's not really the same thing. And many of them also ethanol production, where everything is really easy compared to doing it the way that it's done in this project. So very exciting and great leadership by Denmark. Finland has been very cautious about CCS in general. They said maybe CCU, but CCS we don't know. We cannot store CO2 in our country and so on. But it has changed. So the current Finnish government, has highlighted that Finland has a natural competitive advantage for biomass energy with CCS or CCU. And they aim to introduce instruments that would end. This is written into the sort of declaration that the new government made after winning the election. End both fossil and biogenic point sources, industrial point sources. If this is implemented, with a kind of end year for large emissions, that's to my knowledge the first country in the world to implement such a drastic decision. So big changes in a very short time in Finland. And they're looking at exploring funding solutions, for example, by maybe following the Swedish example, which I will get to, with reverse auctions to select winners for government support, but also other similar mechanisms. So Iceland, obviously host to the world's largest DAX plant. It's not huge in any way, 4,000 tons per year, but DAX is a new and a technology that needs a lot of scaling still. So and the CO2 that is captured in this project is mineralized by the carbon fix method, so it's not really geological CO2 storage, but mineralization. And they're about to construct the next plant, which is 10 times bigger. But I think the interesting thing really with Iceland is it's not really, particularly CDR, but the way that they are planning to develop, carbon storage as a service with a carbon fix company. For example, so they're planning for something they call the Coda terminal, which we will be able to receive CO2 by ships from Europe, and take care of the storage using the carbon fix method. And then obviously for all the DACs and all the BECCS that needs to be done in Europe, this is where some of it, or quite a lot of it, might end up, at least from Northern Europe. So this is interesting from a CDR point of view, definitely. Norway, they have long experience of CCS, obviously, applied to natural gas, but this experience is now being expanded and developed into business models and full value chains. So they have introduced government subsidies for to realize the full CCS value chain, including 2 facilities, a waste incineration plant and a cement plant, and out of which the waste incineration plant is I think 60, 70, 80, can't remember exactly, % biogenic waste. So there's a fraction of BECCS and CDR in this. To be stored in the Northern Lights project off the coast of Norway, and then hopefully, as they envisage, to be further developed, but not as reliant on government support, as a business solution. So they receive other countries, and of course also from Norwegian sources, CO2 to take care of the storage. And without these services, we wouldn't be able to realize the BECCS potentials of Sweden and Finland, for example. Okay. So that was that. Sweden finally gets its own slide, only because it's still last out of 5. We are preparing a support scheme for BECCS in the form of reverse auctions. So 3.6 billion euro approximately has been set aside for this program to fund projects over the period 2026 to 2046. One single project can receive results-based payments for geologically stored CO2 for maximum of period of 15 years. So the goal, the outspoken explicit goal of this is to create what we call supplementary measures to neutralize residual emissions that are necessary to attain the net zero target. The other two options are, as I mentioned, ITMOs from Article 6 and additional sequestration in the land use sector, which might be quite difficult to utilize since the new LULUCF targets in the EU are quite demanding for us. So doing even more than that will be difficult and require a lot. So yeah, there's a target to capture somewhere around 2 million tons biogenic carbon dioxide by 2030 from a few projects, depending on their individual sizes, how many. 1 to 3, probably not 1 or 2, I would say, reverse auctions. Initially, the plan was to have the first auction in 2022, but things take time, and the EU has to approve the state support and so on. All of these things are taking time, and there's a lot of discussion about the design of the system. So let's see if it happens this year, the first one. Of course, so Denmark actually, they started later, but they got going quicker than we did. So congratulations to Denmark for that. What are we doing to implement this? We're preparing a treaty with Norway to enable the Swedish export of carbon dioxide for storage in Norwegian geological formations. This is required due to the London Protocol. And then we have RD&D support, so a lot of probably 20 or so actors in Sweden have received support to do feasibility studies for BECCS in Sweden, and some are getting even perhaps money for the second stage feasibility study and so on, and getting ready to invest. But everyone is waiting for the support system and the reverse auction to it and receive one of those contracts with the Swedish government to actually get paid whatever their bid was in the auction per ton. Other things going on. I know a bit more about what's going on in Sweden than the other countries. We have Fossil-Free Sweden, which is an initiative broadly looking at how sectors in Sweden can become drawing up roadmaps for fossil-free fossil-free future in different sectors. And now there is also a preparation of a cross-sectoral strategy for BECCS. So this will be published this year in the coming months. It's a stakeholder including process where industry and government agencies and academics such as myself are involved to share ideas and discuss how to do things most efficiently. And there is some support for biochar projects as well. The Swedish Energy Agency established an actors network for biochar and so on. But the discussion about biochar and support for biochar or other CDR methods is nowhere near the magnitude of the discussion about support for BECCS. So reflections here. Well, I talked about a testing ground for national net zero targets. Now I'm talking about a testing ground for CDR policy. We have some experience. I mean, there's very much under preparation, and it's early days, but there are lessons to be learned already. There are barriers that need to be addressed, and there are policy areas where Nordic countries need to come up with solutions and perhaps also act jointly to be able to move things in the right direction. And there are some important barriers, for example, for BECCS, which is then very important in our region. there is a moratorium on geoengineering in the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this has implications for BECCS, depending on how one chooses to interpret what is written there. The Swedish interpretation is that it does apply to BECCS, and this has, so this affects the sort of rules that the Swedish Energy Agency will implement as criteria for the reverse auction for BECCS, for example. The Helsinki Convention prohibits CO2 storage below the Baltic Sea. So that needs to be dealt with if we want to develop CO2 storage closer to some of the emission sources than on the other side of Norway. So there are several, member states or really Nordic countries need to work together on understanding where member states should report and account for removals on BECCS and DACs in, firstly, national greenhouse gas inventories. DACs is a more difficult one there because it doesn't really represent any sector of the IPCC guidelines. And at the EU level, and also including cross-border projects where MRV gets complicated. If you capture CCR or biogenic CO2 in Sweden and you store it in Norway, it's not cut in stone actually where the negative or CDR ends up in Sweden or Norway. It has to be agreed, obviously, but it's not like you can just read the rule book and say, okay, it ends up there. So this is a discussion. It has to be determined, obviously, before investments can be made. So management of cross-chain risks. This is a general CCS issues, but it applies to both DACs and BECCS. Who wants to invest in huge capture facilities if you don't know that you have somewhere to store your CO2, and who on time, and who wants to invest and make all the effort that it takes to develop CO2 storage if you don't know that once you're prepared to receive CO2 that someone wants to deliver it. So this is, I would say, a huge challenge for policymakers and the Nordic countries to coordinate, and because we need to make this transition and this scale up of CDR, and including also, or in addition, fossil CCS at an incredible pace. And we don't want any unfortunate situations happening here. So this kind of coordination between countries is extremely important. Terms for market-based solutions involving either international transactions. We can generate CDR surplus in the Nordic countries. Some of the national targets in the Nordic countries go beyond net zero. So there are plans for net negativity beyond the year of net zero. But now with EU policy coming up and so on, perhaps other European countries will want to utilize some of the CDR potential in the Nordic countries. And, so what are the terms for international transfers, essentially? And then how does this affect, who should invest and where and how? But then there is also the voluntary market, with buyers being interested in purchasing CDR from, for example, BECCS projects, as Microsoft did in Denmark. So there is now an initiative that was now announced at COP28 between Sweden and Finland that will pilot a kind of transaction of ITMOs from Sweden to Switzerland and from Switzerland to Sweden, actually trying to do this while Sweden is an EU member state, and EU member states cannot do corresponding adjustments that are requirements for Article 6.2 transactions under the Paris Agreement. So is there any way to work around this? This is the type of issues they will be looking at. And this will be very relevant also for carbon market transactions that have the potential to actually speed up the deployment of CDR beyond what countries want to achieve through to attain their national targets. So just going to the last slide. This is a particularly interesting discussion, I would say, about what is the role of the voluntary carbon market. I mean, voluntary projects or the purchase and voluntary use of carbon credits by companies can do different things. If we look at the blue arrows in this chart, they're sort of helping countries to achieve the targets that they have committed to under the Paris Agreement in their NDCs. Sort of doing something about the action gap, so to speak. That's one thing a voluntary transaction can do. But maybe it's also desirable, maybe some companies who purchase carbon credits and want to use them for offsetting, want to achieve something else. So bringing, adding to the collective ambition level of all countries. So adding ambition to what countries have already achieved. So then that would move us into the red area here. Maybe I should, that's what I should do. Then it's the red arrow, and it's moving the world closer to a 1.5 degree pathway compared to the NDC targets. But that would require that the mitigation outcome is not counted towards a national target. And how to do this in an EU context where corresponding adjustments are not possible. So these kind of discussions about contributions from the voluntary carbon market and what constitutes a credible or trustworthy, truthful offsetting claim is part of the current discussion that about in the interaction between state support to BECCS and voluntary carbon market support to BECCS in both the Danish case, where it has already happened, and in the Swedish case, where companies are preparing for it to happen. And it's not easy, and stakeholders have really opposing views here, and compromises will be needed, and in the end, the solutions that come out of this need to be credible, for the voluntary carbon markets to actually grow and be able to deliver mitigation that the world needs. So it's very important to come up with ideas here and solutions that as many as possible can agree on. I think this is that's it. So I'm gonna leave the rest of the time for discussion now.
Thank you very much. This was very insightful and all-encompassing. I'm very grateful for your presentation. We do have a few questions coming in. We might not have the time to address all of them, but I invite everyone who would like their questions to be answered in the future to reach out to any of us. We would be more than happy to put you in contact and get the discussion going. I would like to start with so you were talking about cross-country cooperation and helping nations with through their own resources and their own specialties. And someone asked while you were asking that, what opportunities would you say exist for interested stakeholders? This can be NGOs, businesses, and researchers to engage with and influence CDR policymaking in the Nordics.
Yeah, I would say that, there are some technical issues where academics could certainly help out, and that relate to the MRV really. What is an appropriate MRV method or system for a BECCS project in an environment where all countries actually have mitigation targets. Many MRV methods that are existing out there are really designed to be implemented in developing countries, because this is where most of the carbon credits were generated in the past, and that the MRV methods were built for. So we have a new situation here, and then we have all these the allocation of the mitigation outcome between the participating parties. But then the last thing I talked about, how to deal with the combination of public finance and private finance from voluntary carbon markets. This is a very important discussion, and whatever type of stakeholder you are, from industry to academics, engage in this discussion and try to work out where there is common ground to be found, so that currently there's a lot of arguments, people, various stakeholders with different perceptions about this, arguing, and we really need to find a solution where we can agree and for investment to happen. I would encourage anyone to engage in this discussion, and also present ideas that can help.
That's definitely one way to get involved. It's by speaking out and sharing their opinion wherever they can. And you're talking about the voluntary carbon market, and I have a question here that's related. The person introduces by saying there's a bit of discussion around the public financial support for the Ørsted project, while credits are still sold on the VCM to, for example, Microsoft, and potential double accounting. And this person asks, what is your perspective on this, and will the reverse auctions work in similar ways?
The difference between the Danish system, which was a procurement-based system, and the Swedish system, which is a reverse auction, is really the difference is where how the bids are received and evaluated. After that, I would say that the situation is quite similar, because there will be a contract between the government and the VEX developer, so that they get paid once they can show verified stored CO2. So not such a big difference really. The question about double counting, and I mean, I have been engaged quite a lot in this discussion, and I think that it's important. We know from the past that if offsetting and voluntary carbon markets are perceived as lacking environmental integrity, they can really pop like a balloon. There was an article in The Guardian about RED projects, and I think the price dropped 80% overnight and didn't really recover. So I mean, these markets rely on credibility, and it's very important to be able to justify the claims that are made. To my mind, if you can base an offsetting claim on arguing that our offsetting is contributing to raising global ambition, that's pretty watertight. Then I mean, there is so much going on in the EU in this space with the Empowering Consumers Directive and green claims. I was reading on your web last night that there has been development on the green claim side, and we also have the CRCF, and so now we have discussions about contribution claims as well. This is important. It's important to be able to communicate in a trustworthy and convincing way what the compensation actually achieves, and that it's not a way to buy your way out of reducing your own emissions, and that the claim that you make is justified. To my mind, double claims can be a bit risky there, and that's my contribution in the discussion in this space in Sweden. I also understand the arguments that we need a lot of investment, and if we can get private capital in here, that's good. I agree that it's good. We just need to be aware of the risk that we might get a very intensive injection of private capital when it's attractive, and then if the reputation is not that good, and then perhaps it's not a sustainable solution. So we need to consider all these things when we come up with solutions. Personally, I would like contribution claims to fly. But someone will have to be willing to pay for it, but we need to say what we actually do. We need to communicate clearly what we're actually doing and what we do, what it actually achieves. I think that would be, first prerequisite.
Thank you. I would like to shift to a more specific question on a very specific target, because someone asks, how do you see the role of Nordic countries, and especially those that are part of the EU, in reaching the new EU target of 50 megatons of CO2 storage by 2030. It's a target that was introduced very recently in the Net Zero Industry Act.
Yeah, this is the storage target. I'm not really so familiar with the storage target and how I have this idea it applies in some way to the fossil industry, and that the obligation is directed towards them. And yeah, we have at least two countries in the Nordics with and in particular one with significant fossil industry and also the opportunity to deliver CO2 storage, and we have the knowledge and experience. So, I mean, to my mind, it's quite obvious that Denmark and Norway at least will contribute to this, and then depending on how well the carb fix method can be commercialized and scaled up, then for sure that's also a very attractive contribution from that country.
Thank you. And going back to something very specific that you mentioned relating to Sweden, someone asked if you could elaborate on Sweden's interpretation of the CBD geoengineering moratorium. This person is specifically interested in how this is influencing the planning of the Swedish Energy Agency.
Right, absolutely. So the moratorium is relevant because the interpretation this was investigated by the Swedish Energy Agency, they concluded that if bioenergy with CCS leads to increased use of biomass, this will affect forestry. And forestry, as we all know, is associated with various impacts that relate to biodiversity. And so it essentially needs to be shown that BECCS project does not have negative impacts on biodiversity. At least that's my understanding. So what the Swedish Energy Agency has proposed they released kind of the proposed criteria for projects in a draft version before Christmas that has been out for stakeholder consultations. So they require the type of, I don't know the English terminology here, but a kind of sustainability certificate for the biomass used. That is, I think, also applied in the context of an EU directive on renewable energy sources. So for a bidder to be a bidder in the reverse auctions for BECCS in Sweden, then you have to provide evidence that you can come up with such certificates.
And actually, this is directly linked into another question that we are asked. Someone is expanding this topic to the Nordics in general, and asking, given the centrality of BECCS in the Nordics, do policymakers consider setting regulations on what would constitute sustainable feedstock and biomass?
Yes, I think it's definitely a topic that is being discussed, because I mean these BECCS projects, they're actually supposed to deliver carbon dioxide removal, and I mean no one can credibly argue that that BECCS delivers carbon dioxide removal unless the biomass that is used is sustainably generated. So yes, it's kind of one of the foundational assumptions that it's necessary.
Indeed. A lot of this discussion is centering around the way regulations not only structures all of these investments, but also uplifts it in a way. And actually, we have, I think, time for one very last question. Someone is asking if, based on your knowledge of EU legislation, is there any that you think is preventing EU member states from using corresponding adjustments to the ones that are being used in the Nordic region?
Well, I think that since the EU has an NDC on the EU level, a corresponding adjustment can only be done on the EU level, and the EU has not created the kind of procedures for doing corresponding adjustments on the EU level. So it simply, I mean, it cannot be done because it has not, preparations for it have not been made. So it's a very simple answer, and we're kind of thinking about ways that how can a Nordic country overachieve in some way and sell mitigation outcome to companies or countries outside of the EU without this overachievement being grabbed by an underachieving EU. So this is interesting and very exciting. That's where people could come in and help out with interesting studies also.
Definitely. I don't want to keep you for longer because we're at time. And this was a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much. I would just like to thank you for taking the time to chat with us and to attending one of this quarterly policy updates. I think it's safe to say, at least for me, that this was extremely insightful. I had not received such a condensed and clear set of information on the Nordics in quite a while. And we like this approach of looking over a region rather than a singular member states or a country in general, because it gives an overview of what can and can be done depending on the region the country is located in. Thank you very much. I won't keep you longer. This was recorded, so with your agreement, we are going to keep this this file, and we will discuss afterwards to see if we could potentially put it on our YouTube channel, if that's okay with you.
It's fine, and I just want to say thanks for the invitation, and thanks for everyone who came to listen and ask questions. And I will enter my email address in the chat, and for those who had questions that we didn't have time to bring up in the discussion, I'm happy to try to shoot an email with some replies. And I will also take a look at whatever is already in there that we haven't had time to discuss. So
great.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you. I'll let you type that out and give everyone a minute or two to leave, and then I will close the session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.